Alrighty, hello everybody. So, if you guys are aware, recently Wuthering Waves released their 3.6 live stream, and today we are going to be quickly running through it in regards to a lore perspective, running through all of the interesting things that were shown throughout the stream. I've boiled them all down to a PowerPoint presentation so that you guys don't have to watch the whole stream if that's lore and story is the only thing you guys are concerned about. So, let's quickly get started. So this was the 3.6 preview live stream. As you guys can see, there is a thumbnail over here, but it's pretty simple, self-explanatory. Besides that, we're going to first talk about the most, sorry, not the most, but the first interesting thing that popped up, which is the commentary on Sin, right? Since a lot of people are obviously quite interested in Sin, she may not appear in this patch, but there were some ominous lines, of course, from the host and the co-host. We saw that, Sin has yet to reveal herself within the story. And one thing I also noticed is that within 3.5, there was quite a lot of interesting commentary from Sin to Suisui about saving lives, about trying to basically follow a preordained course. And there was this one particular line within the trailer of 3.6 that was not attributed to anybody, so you didn't know who was saying it. Saving mortals from the lament is like trying to push back the tide always returns. And that is a bit of a kind of like, of course, defeatist perspective, but regardless of that, I do think it is something that has been brought up quite a bit within Wuthering Waves. Like Wuthering Waves, the waves ebb and flow, the flow of civilization never ceases. And I think that if we take Sin to be a kind of jaded ruler who is following this course that has been set out for her, I think that she may be the speaker, but we don't really know. I just thought it was really interesting to hypothesize about. However, I think most people are, of course, interested about the two characters. Two characters show up. One is Jingren, and I am really excited for Jingren, especially after what we saw in the trailer. I'm actually more excited for Jingren than Qingshao at the current moment. I think Qingshao is like kind of like she's a cool character, but Jingran is really cool, and there was a lot of stuff that came from the live stream that made me really excited for him. So, first things first off, who is Jingren? So we saw Jingren in 3.5 when she was guiding Suisui, but we know from the stream that she is going to take a much more prominent role. One of the things I found really interesting is that he works closely with the Zhao Commerce Guild, so he works with Suisui, right? But he also serves a key informant hidden within Zhuojian Atelier. So he is kind of like a bit of a spy, per se. That means he probably gets himself into quite a lot of trouble, and he's already crossed paths with Muyu on multiple occasions. So he's in like intelligence and broker, right? I don't think he's entirely evil, but from what we know about him so far, he seems a little bit ostracized, doing the work that few people want to do. However, if you know me, Fat Fluffy Penguin, you would know that what I'm more concerned about is the sort of like subtext of a lot of the design of the character's story, and Ingrid definitely does not disappoint. So I think I did mention this already. If you guys follow my Twitter, you would know. A lot of the focus on Jingren's character design, in the stream at least, was focused on his heterochromia, so his different colored eyes. And this is actually something we know to be explained within the kind of like culture and lore already, because this is based on the yin and yang eyes or eye, right? And this is kind of like a spirit eye per se, like sounds very Chunibyo, right? But it's a spirit eye that allows you to see ghosts and spirits. And this is kind of like confirmed by the hosts of the stream themselves when they say that it resembles almost a third eye, right? Like the reason why they call it a third eye is because it's an eye that allows you to perceive the spirit realm per se. And it says able to perceive hidden frequencies but beyond human sight. That's the spirit realm, right, guys? So yeah. However, what was kind of like also rather interesting is how Jingren is kind of like connoting and refers to Chinese hell, or if you guys want to kind of like know, Chinese hell or underworld is called Diyu, right? And he even references in one of his combat lines, join me in the world of Santu, right? And Santu is a word, two words, that in Chinese translate to the three torches. And if you guys are kind of like, let's just say, not new to the channel, you guys have like heard me yap and yap and yap about Dante's Inferno and how hell is split into multiple layers stacked on top of each other. DU is kind of like that. I feel like it feels a bit wrong to compare the two, but DU is comprised of multiple places in hell, right? And one of these punishment places is called Santu, right? Which is made up of torture, kind of like departments. It sounds really weird to say that. Torture departments, you have Huotu, which is fire torture, Gaotu, which is blade torture, Xuetu, which is blood torture, and all of these are meant to refer to and reflect a kind of pain or suffering, right? So that's like kind of like where Santu comes from. Found that very interesting, even from a combat line. But there is something even more fascinating about Jingren, and that is how he links to Zhong Kui. And this was actually pointed out to me by someone on Twitter, so big props to him. I think I'll show who that person was in the next slide. But Zhong Kui is a Taoist deity, right? He is the king and vanquisher of ghosts and spirits. He's able to command 80,000 demons, so Ba Wan, Gui, or whatever. And what's really interesting is that I think it's after seeing the 3.6 live stream, I think it's basically beyond argument that Zhong Kui is the inspiration behind Jingren because it's so many similarities and parallels. It's actually patently absurd, right? So Zhong Kui, we'll talk about like what these similarities are later, by the way. So you guys need to hold your horses for a bit. You talk a little bit about who Zhong Kui is. So he's a Taoist deity, and he is known for slaying demons, vanquishing them, and he also has Wufu, or like five bats. The reason why they're called bats is because um, bats and fortune kind of are two words that sound very similar in Chinese. And these bats, of course, represent health, wealth, long life, virtue, and a peaceful death. So yeah, he's like carries these fortunate bats. He has like weapons like the Jin and stuff like that. He uses a lot of Taoist tools, which we're going to talk about later. And the reason why he became a ghost slayer is because Zhong Kui, in a lot of stories, was a weapons master. He was the one of the people like the that scored the highest on the imperial civil examination. But the reason, like whether he was a civil servant or a soldier, he was rejected by the emperor because his appearance was too ugly. So he, in some stories, he either wandered into the wilds and kind of like died completely unknown, or out of shame for what the emperor said, he committed suicide at the emperor's gates. But all of the stories involve him being ostracized because he was ugly, and he died, became a ghost slayer after death. That's his villain origin story. He's not really a villain per se, right? So what's also really interesting is that you can see on this like previous slides, there's a bit of like a tiger next to him, right? And you may be wondering like who the hell this tiger is. That tiger is actually reflected in Jingran as well, right? And he has like this kind of spirit, which is a remnant creature with extraordinary origin, very similar to Galbrenner's Chimera, right? And Jingran's spirit is very obviously, let's see how it's like a tiger, right? Tiger head. It's based on Tubor, and Tubor is the warden of the underworld, or Diyu, right? Kind of like how you would see Cerberus. And you can, even though we don't fully have like a concrete uniform description of what Tubor looks like, a lot of accounts place him as looking like something with the head of a tiger. Like, for example, from the verses of Chu, you have this kind of quote which says Tubo was a ghost with three eyes and a tiger's head, right? So that's kind of like quite well documented, and that's why, of course, Zhong Kui being kind of like this ghost slayer, this sort of like policeman of hell, I guess you could say, is oftentimes depicted with a tiger, right? Because of Tubo. So that's kind of like already you can see on the stream tons and tons of like links to Chinese culture. I'm very excited for Jingran. And if you thought that was it, you guys are wrong because there's even more links that Jingran has with Zhong Kui and stuff like that because he has a weapon, right? You guys may have seen that he has a bit of a life lamp, right? And it was directly confirmed in the stream. And the life lamp is really interesting because Zhong Kui has a lot of weapons, Two of them are called Zhong Kui's hammer. This was a guy that was talking about Zhong Kui, that I was talking about in previous slides, by the way. So credits to him for like first finding all this stuff. So he has Zhong Kui's hammer, and he also has the soul guiding lantern, right? And that's why Zhongkui is oftentimes associated with kind of like these trinkets and tools, is because these help him navigate the underworld, and these towers kind of like stuff and things help him kind of like vanquish or contain spirits, right? And I think in the live stream was mentioned as well that the spirits are kind of like contained within the life lamp. That's why, for example, his spirit over here actually lives in the life lamp and just comes out when it gets bored or something, right? This spirit is like dwelling in here. However, there is one final slide on Zhong Kui, right? As I said before, it's pretty obvious Zhong Kui is based on Jingran, right? And that is Zhong Kui's weapon. Because how does Zhong Kui actually fight demons and ghosts and spirits and stuff? It's with his signature Jin, right? Because remember, before Zhong Kui died, he was a weapons master. He was like the top of the civil service exam. He knew how to use a sword, a Jin, right? And of all the weapon types that Jingran could have used, gauntlets, kind of like, broadswords or whatever, he uses a sword, which is just a gem, right? And what's really interesting is that Zhong Kui uses a gem alongside a lot of like our other like Taoist trinkets and stuff. And you can actually see what's wrapped around like Jingran's signature weapon, Taoist, kind of like talismans, like beads and stuff like that. All of these are just so linked to Zhong Kui's actual weapons that he uses in Chinese mythology, demon slaying sword. There's so many parallels. You guys can probably tell, right? Have the free Leviathan gif, kind of like, oh shit, demon slayer sword. Oh, what the hell? Yeah. Anyway, so one final thing that was kind of like not linked is you can kind of see in uh, Jingren's alt animation, which is shown in the stream, there is a bit of a gate opening up. And I actually talked about this already. You can read it on Twitter. You guys can pause the video if you guys want to read the full thing. But this is called the Guimen, which is kind of like the devil gate or hell gate. Like Gui is like a Chinese word which can mean ghost, spirit, demon. So it can mean so many things, right? So Guimen is like this devil gate where all dead spirits have to kind of like when they go to living world, they have to go through a Guimen. So a Guimen is kind of like a gateway between the lands of like the living and the dead, of like the living and hell and whatever, right? You kind of get the gist of it. So next up we have Qing Shao, and I think Qing Shao, honestly, like after stream, I'm a Jingren fan now. Like a Qingshao is kind of like, yeah, she's interesting, but like Jingren is like so cool, man. So like I'm not like the biggest Qingshao fan. I'll kind of like tell you guys why as well, right? So who is Qingshao? We already kind of like saw she had a big moment in 3.5 because she is the sword transcendent. We'll talk about what the sword transcendent means actually, but she's kind of like a living immortal. We'll talk about why a living immortal is pretty important, but she's kind of a bit of an elusive figure. I'm sure we'll learn more about her, but she is also a cultivator. And what does that mean? Cultivation equals shansha, right? And shansha is what I like to call cultivation slop. You can kind of see it from like the last line over here. I'm not a big fan of this genre. I don't like shansha or cultivation. I just don't like the genre, guys. Like, I'm not a big fan of cultivation. Never was. Like, I think wuxia is like way better. If you want to read kind of like these Chinese like martial fiction or whatever. But shansha, right, means immortal heroes. So the reason why it's called Immortal Heroes is because the end goal of cultivation is to become like a living god, right? Like immortal gods. And the genre is heavily inspired by like Buddhism, Taoism, tons and tons of like other stuff. Like a lot of like basically like Chinese mysticism goes into the Shanshan genre, which is why you see a lot of like magic and supernatural elements, right? And the whole kind of like central gimmick of this genre is cultivation. And cultivation is basically um primarily just gathering chi to like refine your inner energies, become like a god and stuff like that. I feel like it's so boring. So that's why like I don't like cultivation. But it's a bit more than just covering gathering chi. You also have something like, for example, internal and external alchemy. Stuff like Neidan, right? And this is stuff I talked about within Bullying story, because Bullying talks a lot about Neidan. And a lot of her kit actually references like not just the fictional, but supposedly like mystical, alchemical, real life manuscripts of how to perform Neidan, right? So basically, instead of like martial arts, because it's so much like mysticism, as I said before, a lot of like magic, supernatural elements, and that's why you have a lot of magic. One of the most famous of these is the art of flying sword, or like the sword formation. And if that sounds very familiar, that's because it's literally just what Qing Shao does, right? She is like, it sounds kind of mean to say this, but she is basically just cultivation slop the character, right? Which is why, like, I'm not as big of a fan. Like, I'm not saying she's not interesting, but like compared to Jingren, right? Like, I like Jingren as a character way better. So anyway, so you guys may have noticed on the last slide I talked about the sword formation, and the sword formation is actually a kind of offensive art where in Shansha, a lot of like cultivation practitioners, their weapon of choice is to condense their chi into swords, right? And the sword formation is kind of like what you see here, like Qingshao is like using this. You can ride swords, of course, because it's technically part of your chi, and you can also like dangle swords in the air in a formation to basically use them as a kind of like offensive, like artillery formation, right? Because like if you could do this, there's no reason for anyone in the Shansha universe to invent guns because everyone just uses like 10 trillion swords formed from their magic chi. So anyway, another thing that was really interesting was that there was this specific slide within the 3.6 trailer where Qing Shao actually has to teach Rover how to use a sword. And you may notice there's a very particular formation, or sorry, not formation, or like kind of stance that they're using. And when you consolidate everything that we talked about with how Shansha is about like consolidating your chi and stuff like that, this is actually called a jinsu, which is like the sword finger, where you point your two fingers towards your opponent or like where you want to strike, because it was thought that you would channel your chi towards that direction. So even like, for example, this thing is like pretty based not just in like Shansha, but also just in Chinese martial arts in general. So yeah, pretty interesting fact if you didn't know about it. But one other thing about Qing Shao's character is her constant playing of the Guqing. And we talked a lot about this already, because technically this was already mentioned in Buling's character story when Buling talked to um, Qing Shao. But one very interesting thing about the Guqing that I think not a lot of people talk about is that since we already talked about how Qing Shao is like cultivation slop, the character, the Guqing is actually a instrument which is very suited for her. Because unlike a lot of other instruments that you would um, see, especially within a Western context, right? I think a lot of Western instruments are like performative, like not performative in a bad way, but like performative as in they are like designed to be used in like an orchestral or performative kind of environment. But a lot of Chinese instruments are not, like the guqing or like, for example, the bamboo flute and stuff like that. These are all meant to be played for oneself. And the guqing was oftentimes a instrument kind of like played by Chinese scholars and intellectuals who are like Wenren or like cultured individuals or whatever. And this was kind of like designed to cultivate your inner self, like not cultivate your chi, but like cultivate how cultured and intellectual you were, like internally. That sounds like really weird, but like cultivate your inner self, right? And that's why, like again, that's why I'm saying like Qing Shao is like cultivation slop the character, right? Because obviously she cultivates in a Shansha kind of sense, but she's also cultivating with the Guqing, like her like own self, which is like, yeah, okay, like it's creating a very um sort of like well built and like what's the word to describe this, well built and um congruent character. I can't think of another word, sorry. But anyway, some other things that I found really interesting was there was this one scene, kind of like a bit of a spoiler from the story, I suppose, where you saw like this is probably like Qing Shao's domain because you see swords lying everywhere. You have a very interesting tree. I haven't really like looked into what this tree was, but it looks very particular. But the full moon, right? Moons pretty damn important in Wuthering Waves, if I say so myself. And the full moon is symbolic of wholeness of self in Chinese culture, as well as the female yin energy. And I think that in the song Isidis, if you guys remember from my lyrical analysis, the last line of the song even talked about the full moon, and that was used in the context of like completing one's like emotional self. And I think that this scene, like popping up in the 3.6 on live stream, really just instantly grabbed my attention just because of the song Isidis. Like in Isidis, the opening song for Mengzhou, the full moon was mentioned in the very, very last line of the song. So yeah, good thing to keep in the back of your head, right? The other thing was there was this thing kind of like sky barges, right? So these floating ships kind of like traveling, you can kind of see them already from the thumbnail of the live stream. But one thing I found really interesting is that, the technology behind these colossal constructs appears even more advanced than anything found in Xuanfang today, which suggests to me that perhaps these were built by something even more advanced than the CSC, or like this is like a remnant of like CSC's past projects, maybe. Because in the world of Wuthering Waves, aerodynamics is really difficult. I think there was like the aircraft crash investigation report that has basically kind of like shown that space flight, let alone air flight, is really difficult. So you do need pretty good technology to accomplish this. And is it something even more kind of like interesting with this? How these ships are so massive, they seem like cities suspended in the sky. I'm not sure if this is like a concrete reference, but the first thing I thought about when I saw like the scale of these ships was like Zheng He's treasure fleet, right? So I think this was during the Ming Dynasty. The Admiral Zheng He created like these massive treasure ships that were like, I think like we don't look, it's very controversial how big exactly these ships were, but I think that we can agree they were like massive, almost like city like structures, designated to like hold like thousands of people. So yeah, like this is like just like what I like sort of like thought, especially because there was so many of them flying together. It just made me remember like Zheng He's treasure fleet, but in a kind of obviously like a modern and futuristic machine like sense. So beyond that, also one very interesting thing that was caught very easily missed in the 3.6 story was the appearance of Swarming, because Swarming has not appeared in the story currently. So there's one scene, like I think it's like 2 bloody seconds, where she's meeting with Yinlin for some reason. So that might be because Yinlin has been sent to Mengzhou for business, and Yinlin is of course is kind of like a covert operative now. We learned that because of the mansion, the Midnight Mansion event, where we met Yinlin, and she told us like, "Oh yeah, Madame Jinsa gave me a new job, and I'm like an undercover spy now." What's also really interesting is that Swarming, right? We talked about her before. There's possible symbolic implications of her, especially from her name and drip marketing, which shows that she may possibly be kind of like a prison warden or someone very connected to imprisoning or trapping TDs. And what's very interesting, at the very end of the stream, you see her like flying literally like Bloody Mary Poppins or something, with her umbrella, quite fascinating, into a kind of like decrepit, well, not really decrepit, but like sort of like Infinity Castle looking, like prison sort of thing, which is like maybe the containment zone that we will see later on, maybe below Mengzhou or something else. That's pretty interesting. Final thing that I talked about was that there was another kind of like dimension that was introduced with the map of 3.6, and this is kind of like this Ren realm, which is really interesting because in Chinese mythology, like usually the world is split into like multiple like realms, right? You have like the Chinese equivalent of hell, you have heaven, but in between here you have like the mortal realm. And I think the Ren realm, because like Ren in like, I don't know the specific Chinese character, but like Ren just means people, like mortals, right? So beyond the Ren realm kind of like seems to me like it's basically saying beyond the mortal realm, there's kind of like a higher dimension or like hell, or like I don't even know, but there definitely seems to be some kind of like dimension beyond, of course, the mortal realm, because like Ren realm is like the mortal realm. Maybe up or below, who knows, right? But that was the gist of the 3.6 live stream. If you guys enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe, comment your thoughts, even become a channel member if you enjoyed, really enjoyed. But I am tired as all hell, so I do have some video ideas prepared, but I will definitely need to be going to bed. Hopefully you guys have a great rest of the day, a great rest of the night in my case, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good day.